The ornate fountain pen, a conduit for a multi-billion-dollar deal, hovered mere inches from the signature line. Careers hung in the balance, the culmination of months of relentless negotiation. Suddenly, a voice, young but resolute, cut through the boardroom's charged silence. "Excuse me, sir." All heads turned. A young woman, an outsider in this world of polished power, stood at the threshold, her eyes locked on the man at the head of the table. The boss. "But that clause you're about to initial, it's a trap." The boss's hand froze mid-air. The pen remained suspended, a hair's breadth from the paper, and the confident, triumphant smile he wore, the one that signaled victory. It didn't just falter. It vanished, instantly. What devastating secret lies hidden in plain sight, and who will pay the ultimate price when it's exposed? Hit subscribe and let us know in the comments. Could one voice truly unravel an empire built on deceit? The evening chill of late autumn had long since settled over the city, its tendrils creeping through the silent, empty corridors of Pierce Industries. On the 47th floor, the executive suites lay shrouded in a hushed reverence, the domain of power brokers and decision-makers, now abandoned to the dim glow of emergency lights and the rhythmic hum of the building's life support. Almost abandoned. Maria Miller, her movements economical, with the ingrained fatigue of 1,000 such nights, guided her cleaning cart along the plush carpet. Her daughter Ava trailed a few steps behind a well-worn textbook palavras, pro on corporate ethics peeking from her backpack, a stark contrast to the industrial-grade spray bottle palavras, pro in her hand. At 19, Ava possessed an observant stillness, a mind that seemed to absorb and dissect the world around her with an unnerving acuity. Tonight, like many nights, she was helping Maria earning a little palavras. Pro extra, yes, but more so keeping her mother company in the echoing solitude of the corporate behemoth. Just this last office, Mama Ava murmured, her voice soft. "Then we can finally head home." Maria nodded, a tired smile, palavras, pro touching her lips. Mr. Henderson's office, always the last one, and always a mess after one of his brainstorming sessions. As Maria set to work on the main office area, Ava was tasked with the small adjoining copy room. It was there, nestled in the output tray of the behemoth photocopier, that she saw it. A thick, leather-bound document carelessly left behind. Its cover bore the embossed Pierce Industries logo and the stark, unambiguous title, Project Titan. Final merger agreement. Curiosity, an old and familiar companion to Ava, tugged at her. She knew she shouldn't. It was an unspoken rule they were ghosts in this world of polished mahogany, and billion-dollar deals there to erase the day's remnants, not to engage with them. But the sheer weight of the document, the gravity of its title. Something compelled her. With a quick glance towards the main office, where her mother was vacuuming, Ava carefully slid the document free. Her eyes, accustomed to deciphering the dense prose of her textbooks, scanned the initial pages, a sea of legalese standard recitals definitions. Then, as she delved deeper, a small frown, palavras, pro, creased her brow. She began to flip pages more purposefully, her gaze sharpening. She'd taken a free online introductory law course last summer, more out of a desire to understand the frameworks that governed the world than any specific career ambition. And her grandfather, a retired union negotiator, had often spoken of the devil hidden in the details of contracts, the subtle shifts in language that could turn a promise into a prison. What in the world? She whispered, her finger, tracing a particularly convoluted paragraph in section 14, subsection C. Liability, indemnification. The words themselves were heavy, but it was the way they were structured, the almost imperceptible transfer of ultimate responsibility that made her breath catch. It was a masterpiece of obfuscation, a clause so cleverly buried, so artfully worded, that it appeared benign. But to Ava's freshly trained analytical mind, it screamed danger. She reread it, and then again. A cold knot began to form in her stomach. "No, this can't be right," she muttered, pulling out her phone and quickly searching a few legal terms, her earlier weariness forgotten, replaced by a dawning, horrifying understanding. Oh, this is bad. This is a trap. She could almost hear her grandfather's voice. "Always look for who benefits most when things go wrong, little star. That's where the real story is." And in this clause, Pierce Industries stood to lose everything if the newly merged entity faltered, while the other party, Thorne Consolidated, would walk away virtually unscathed. Ava imagined the implications: lawsuits, defaults, financial ruin. All of it, according to this meticulously crafted sentence, would fall squarely on Pierce Industries, her mother's employer, the company whose late-night cleaning shifts paid for their small apartment, for Ava's community college textbooks. Her heart hammered against her ribs. What could she possibly do? She was Ava Miller, daughter of Maria. Miller, the night shift janitor. Who would listen to her? The sheer audacity of even considering. It was terrifying. Her mother's job, their livelihood. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and it could all be gone. Maria had always warned her, "Keep your head down, Ava. Do your work. We don't get involved." But then the image of that clause, a venomous snake, palavras, coiled within the dry legal language, flashed in her mind. Could she live with herself if she said nothing? If she let this happen, the weight of that potential silence felt heavier than any fear. Taking a deep breath, she tucked the heavy document back where she found it, her mind racing. She knew the executive boardroom was on this floor. She also knew from snippets of conversations overheard that tonight was the night of the signing. Mr. Pierce himself was supposedly here late with the Thorne Consolidated team. "Mama," she said, her voice a little too tight as she re-entered Mr. Henderson's main office. I think I left my water bottle in the hallway near the main boardroom. I'll be right back." Maria, preoccupied with a stubborn coffee stain, merely nodded. "Don't be long, Ava. It's late." Ava's steps were a strange mixture of dread and determination as she approached the imposing double doors of the Pierce Industries boardroom. Soft light spilled from beneath them, and the low murmur of voices could be heard. This was insane. Utterly insane. But the alternative, the silence, felt like a betrayal of something fundamental within her. She could see through the slight gap where one off-dacta the heavy doors hadn't quite latched, a sliver of the scene within. Richard Pierce, the man whose face she'd only ever seen in the glossy pages of business magazines, sat at the head of the enormous polished table. His silver-streaked hair gleamed under the recessed lighting. He looked every inch the titan of industry, confident, powerful. Beside him, looking radiant and proud, was his wife, Eleanor Pierce, a picture of supportive elegance. Across from them sat Marcus Thorne, a man whose smile seemed a little too wide, a little too predatory even from this distance. Several other stern-faced executives flanked them. The air was thick with anticipation. A fresh set of documents, identical to the one Ava had just examined, lay open before Richard Pierce. His hand, holding an expensive-looking fountain pen, hovered just above the signature line. Marcus Thorne was speaking, his voice smooth, persuasive. "A new era of prosperity for both our great companies, Richard. A true partnership." Richard Pierce smiled, a broad, satisfied smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. It was the smile of a man on the cusp of a great triumph, a legacy-defining moment. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the paper. Indeed, Marcus, to a new era. The pen began its descent. Ava's breath hitched. It was now or never. Her carefully constructed plan of accidentally bumping into someone leaving the room or catching a junior assistant vanished. There was no time. Before she could second-guess the torrent of courage palavras, surging through her, she pushed the door open just enough to slip through. The sudden movement, the unexpected presence drew a few startled glances. Her janitorial access card, clipped to her simple T-shirt, suddenly felt like a brand. All eyes were on her. The room, moments before a low hum of agreement, fell into a stunned, pin-drop silence. Ava's voice, though trembling slightly, cut through the stillness, clear and direct. "Mr. Pierce," she began, her gaze locking with his surprised, now questioning eyes. "Excuse me for interrupting, sir. I apologize. But that clause, Section 14, subsection C." She took another deeper breath, the words of her grandfather echoing. "Speak truth, little star, even if your voice shakes." "That clause, sir, it's a trap." Richard Pierce's hand froze. The expensive fountain pen remained suspended a hair's breadth from the pristine paper. And the broad, confident smile, it didn't just waver, it vanished, instantly, replaced by an unreadable sharp stillness that sent a chill down Ava's spine, even as a small, fierce part of her felt a sliver of grim satisfaction. The first domino had fallen. The silence that descended upon the boardroom was no longer one of hushed anticipation, but of fractured disbelief. It was as if Ava Miller's words, "It's a trap," had sucked all the air from the opulent space, leaving behind a vacuum where polite corporate decorum had once resided. Eleanor Pierce was the first to recover her perfectly composed expression, tightening almost imperceptibly. A small, dismissive laugh like the tinkle of ice in an empty glass escaped her lips. "Richard, darling," she said, her voice a silken rebuke. "What on earth is this? Some kind of prank? This young woman is clearly confused." She gestured vaguely towards Ava, as if she were an errant piece of furniture. Marcus Thorne, ever the opportunist, quickly followed suit, his earlier predatory smile morphing into one of condescending amusement. "Indeed, Richard. An overzealous cleaning staff, perhaps commendable diligence, I'm sure, but hardly qualified to interpret complex legal agreements." He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Shall we proceed? We have a multi-billion-dollar merger to finalize after all." He picked up his own pen, tapping it pointedly on the table, an unsubtle pressure. Richard Pierce, however, didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on Ava. The initial shock, the flicker of indignation at being so publicly interrupted by a janitor's daughter, was now being overlaid by something else, a disquieting echo of the conviction in Ava's voice. She hadn't been hysterical or accusatory in a wild way. She had been precise. Frightened, yes, but her eyes held an unnerving clarity. Section 14. Subsection C. She'd named it. He was a man who prided himself on his intuition, a gut feeling honed over decades of navigating the treacherous waters of high finance. And right now that intuition was a discordant symphony in his ears. The swift, almost too eager dismissals from his wife and his soon-to-be partner felt off. "Perhaps," Richard said slowly, his voice carefully neutral, his eyes finally shifting from Ava to meet Marcus Thorne's impatient stare. "A brief recess is in order. Just to clarify this young woman's concern. Due diligence, Marcus, you understand." He offered a thin, unconvincing smile. Thorne's jaw tightened. "Due diligence was completed weeks ago by an army of lawyers, Richard. Are we really going to halt proceedings because of this?" His gesture towards Ava was openly contemptuous now. Eleanor placed a perfectly manicured hand on Richard's arm. "Darling, don't be absurd. She's a child, Let security handle her, and let's get this done. We have investors waiting a press conference scheduled, but Richard gently removed her hand. Nevertheless, a 5-minute pause. He looked towards his personal assistant, who hovered nervously by the door. Miss Albright, please escort Miss Miller, sir. Ava Miller. Ava supplied her voice, still a little shaky but firm. Miss Miller to my private study. Offer her some water. I'll join her shortly. The unspoken command in his tone brooked no argument, not even from Eleanor, whose smile was now a brittle, painted-on thing. Ava, with a final steady look at Richard Pierce, allowed herself to be led from the room, the heavy doors closing behind her with a soft, definitive click. The moment Ava was gone, Maria Miller found herself a target. Mr. Davies, the night shift supervisor, a man whose loyalty to the Pierce corporate hierarchy, and by extension to Eleanor Pierce's sphere of influence, was absolute, cornered her by the service elevator. Maria, he hissed, his face flushed with anger. What in God's name was your daughter thinking marching into the boardroom like that? Does she want to get us both fired? Maria's heart sank. Mr. Davies, I don't know what happened. Ava is a good girl, a smart girl. Smart doesn't pay the bills if she's making enemies of Mr. and Mrs. Pierce. Davies, cut her off. You better get her under control. One more stunt like this and I can't protect your job. Understand? Maria understood all too well. Later, when she and Ava were finally in the quiet anonymity of their small apartment, Maria's worry spilled out, mixed with an undeniable, if exasperated, sliver of pride. Ava, child, she sighed, sinking onto the worn sofa. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. Next time you decide to save the corporate world, could you perhaps send them an email instead of gate-crashing their billion-dollar meetings? She shook her head, but then a small, worried smile played on her lips. Though I must admit for a moment there, watching you through that crack in the door, you looked like a general. Back in his silent, mahogany-paneled study, Richard Pierce did not call for security. Instead, he made a call to a young, razor-sharp legal associate in the corporate strategy division, Sarah Jennings. Someone bright, ambitious, and most importantly, someone who hadn't been involved in the months-long, torturous Project Titan negotiations. Someone whose eyes were fresh. Sarah, Richard said, his voice low and urgent. I'm sending you a section of a contract. Section 14, subsection C. I need your unvarnished, immediate opinion on it. No context, just your legal interpretation of that specific language. And Sarah, this stays strictly between us. Understood, Mr. Pierce. Within the hour, Sarah Jennings' preliminary assessment landed in his private inbox. It was cautiously worded as befitted. A junior associate asked to critique a document, presumably vetted by senior partners, but the implication was clear. The language in this subsection, Mr. Pierce appears to place a disproportionate and potentially uncapped level of post-merger liability onto Party A Pierce Industries. Further review is strongly recommended to ascertain the full scope and potential financial exposure. A cold dread far more profound than the initial shock in the boardroom began to seep into Richard's bones. Ava Miller, the janitor's daughter, had seen something his high-priced legal team, his trusted advisers, and even he himself had missed. Or a more sinister thought began to form something they had allowed to be missed. He leaned back in his leather chair, the silence of the vast office pressing in on him. He thought of the relentless pressure from Marcus Thorne to expedite the deal the way Eleanor had so smoothly dismissed any minor concerns he'd voiced weeks ago about certain aggressive timelines. He had chalked it up to her ambition, her desire to see him succeed, to see them solidify their empire. Driven by a new urgent unease, Richard instructed his most trusted IT forensics expert, a quiet, unassuming man named Peterson, who usually dealt with the external threats, to do a deep dive into archived emails related to Project Titan, specifically any communications involving Thorne Eleanor and the senior legal counsel who had signed off on the agreement. He was looking for, he wasn't entirely sure what, a gut feeling again. That discordant symphony. It didn't take long. Peterson, working late into the night, unearthed a chain of emails from nearly 6 months prior. It was an internal discussion, a brief flurry of messages around an initial risk assessment of Thorne Consolidated. A junior analyst, now long gone from the company, had flagged a pattern in Thorne's past smaller acquisitions, a tendency towards deals where his company shed liabilities onto the acquired entity with alarming efficiency. The concern had been escalated to a mid-level manager, a man Richard vaguely recalled Eleanor had strongly recommended for promotion a year or so back. The manager's response, CC'd to the then head of legal, was dismissive. Overblown caution. Thorne is a shrewd operator, that's all. Project Titan is a different league. Approved for fast track. Richard stared at the words, approved for fast track on his screen. The date of that email was just days before Eleanor had first enthusiastically presented the golden opportunity of merging with Thorne Consolidated Painting, Marcus Thorne, as a visionary partner. The pieces weren't fitting together. They were clashing, creating a picture far uglier, far more disturbing than he could have ever imagined. The doubt Ava Miller had planted was no longer a fragile seed. It was beginning to sprout its roots, taking hold in the fertile ground of long-ignored warnings and convenient oversights. The days that followed the boardroom upheaval were a blur of anxiety for Ava Miller. The weight of what she'd done, the sheer audacity of it, pressed down on her. Her mother Maria, though outwardly trying to maintain a brave face, was visibly on edge, her usual quiet cheerfulness replaced by a nervous apprehension every time the phone rang, or there was an unexpected knock at their apartment door. Mr. Davies, the night supervisor, had made his displeasure clear, and Maria's work hours were subtly yet pointedly made more difficult, less desirable sections more scrutinized work. It was a silent, insidious form of pressure designed to make them both regret Ava's intervention. Ava found solace, as she often did in the anonymous corners of the internet, on a small niche forum dedicated to corporate ethics and whistleblower experiences, a place she frequented more for academic curiosity than any expectation of participation. She typed out a heavily veiled account of her discovery. She named no names, no company, just the general structure of a deceptive contract clause she'd stumbled upon and the moral dilemma it presented. She didn't expect replies, certainly not specific ones. It was more a way to vent her own swirling thoughts, to feel a little less alone with the heavy secret. To her surprise, a private message landed in her forum inbox a day later. The sender's username was Cassandra2, and the message was brief, almost cryptic. The patterns you describe sound disturbingly familiar. I once tilted at similar windmills. If you're willing to speak under strict anonymity, I'm willing to listen. Some traps have a signature. Ava hesitated. Her mother's warnings about trusting strangers online echoed in her mind. But something in the phrasing, tilted at similar windmills, some traps have a signature, resonated with a weary, knowing intelligence. After a restless night, she replied, equally cautious, agreeing to an encrypted chat. The voice that eventually greeted her through her laptop speakers was that of a man tired but with an undercurrent of dry wit. He introduced himself as Samuel Cole. As he began to speak, Ava listened, spellbound. Samuel, it turned. Popolazione was a former senior financial analyst at Pierce Industries. He'd been, in his own words, unceremoniously shown the door nearly 5 years prior. The reason he'd raised red flags repeatedly and vociferously about a series of proposed smaller ventures with none other than Marcus Thorne. Thorne Samuel said, his voice laced with a cynicism that only years of bitter experience could cultivate, is an artist in his own way. A con artist, to be precise. His specialty is weaving these beautiful, intricate financial webs that look like silk, but are pure steel when the trap springs. He makes liability disappear for himself and reappear magically enlarged on the other guy's balance sheet. He chuckled a humorless sound. I tried to tell Richard Pierce. Oh, I tried. Sent him memos thick enough to stop a door. But Pierce, back then, well, let's just say, he was more inclined to listen to the siren song of quick profits and the people closest to him who sang it the loudest. Samuel didn't name Eleanor, but Ava felt a chill. He explained some of Thorne's previous tactics, the specific kinds of clauses he favored, the way he cultivated an air of unimpeachable success. Much of it mirrored with chilling accuracy what Ava had deciphered in the Project Titan agreement. So this clause, you found young Lady Samuel concluded it wasn't an accident. It was a signature. Thorne's signature. Meanwhile, Richard Pierce was on his own journey into the past. The unsettling email chain unearthed by Peterson had led him to request Samuel Cole's complete personnel file from the archives. He'd vaguely remembered Cole as a competent, if somewhat abrasive, analyst. What he found in the dusty file, however, was a revelation that turned his stomach. Detailed memorandums, meticulously researched reports, all from Cole, all pointing to questionable practices by Thorne's companies, all suggesting extreme caution. And attached to each one were Richard's own dismissive sign-offs or worse notes from his then chief financial officer, a man Eleanor had championed, advising that Cole was being overly pessimistic and not a team player. Richard could almost feel Eleanor's gentle, persuasive hand on his arm, as she'd likely endorsed those views, smoothing over any nascent doubts he might have had. The weight of his own past negligence, his blind trust, settled upon him like a physical burden. He had been a fool, a confident, powerful fool, easily manipulated by those he'd allowed closest. The image of Samuel Cole, a man who had tried to do the right thing and had been punished for it, haunted him. Richard resolved to find him not just for information, but perhaps to begin to atone for an old, unacknowledged injustice. Eleanor and Marcus Thorne, for their part, were not idle. They sensed Richard's shift, the new unnerving quietness in him, the way his eyes now seemed to scrutinize rather than simply accept. Eleanor, with her practiced grace, tried to fill the silence with reassurances, with affection, blaming the unfortunate interruption for his unease. "Darling, you're letting that silly girl get to you," she'd coo her touchlight on his shoulder. "Marcus is just as eager as we are to put this behind us and celebrate." Marcus Thorne, meanwhile, was working through his own channels. Phone calls were made. Favors were subtly called in. The message, though never explicitly stated, began to filter down through the Pierce Industries hierarchy. The merger was vital, Richard was under stress, and any internal dissent or rumor-mongering would be dealt with severely. The initial legal team that had vetted the contract suddenly became very vocal about its impeccable soundness, their reports now glowing with retroactive confidence. Ava felt the chill of this unspoken campaign. One evening, as she was returning home from her community college classes, she found a plain white envelope slipped under her apartment door. No stamp, no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper contained a crudely typed message: "Smart girls know when to keep quiet. Some traps are best left unsprung. For your mother's sake." Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just about corporate intrigue anymore. This was a direct personal threat. She clutched the note, her hand trembling, not just with fear, but with a rising tide of anger. They were trying to silence her, to intimidate her family. She immediately called Samuel Cole, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and defiance. Samuel listened grimly. "I was afraid of this, Ava," he said, his usual wry tone gone replaced by a grave seriousness. "Thorn doesn't like loose ends, and he certainly doesn't like being challenged, especially by someone he perceives as insignificant. This means you're a threat, a real one." When Ava relayed the threat to Richard Pierce, who had managed to track Samuel down earlier that day for a tense but ultimately revelatory meeting, something inside Richard snapped. The lingering vestiges of doubt, the cautious executive weighing risks and blowback, were consumed by a protective fury. This young woman, this child almost had risked everything to tell him the truth. A truth his own wife was now almost certainly a part of concealing. And now she was being threatened. "This ends now," Richard said, his voice a low growl not to Ava, but to Samuel and to himself. They've gone too far. The shadows of the past were no longer just haunting him. They were actively trying to destroy the present. And Richard Pierce, for the first time in a long while, felt the stirrings of the fighter he once was before comfort and complacency had dulled his edges. He wouldn't just uncover the trap, he would disarm it, and then he would find out who set it. Every last one of them. The air in Richard Pierce's expansive home study, usually a sanctuary of quiet contemplation and leather-bound wisdom, was now thick with an unspoken tension that vibrated beneath the veneer of forced civility. He had called this urgent meeting ostensibly to discuss a resolution to the unfortunate delay in the Project Titan signing. Marcus Thorne had arrived with an air of impatient confidence, clearly expecting Richard to have come to his senses. Eleanor, his wife, sat beside Richard on the plush Chesterfield sofa, her expression a carefully curated mask of supportive concern, though her eyes held a flicker of something Richard now recognized as wariness. Standing quietly by the grand fireplace, an unexpected addition to this intimate gathering, was Rachel Evans. Richard had introduced her simply as a legal consultant. "I've engaged for a second opinion on some pressing corporate matters." Her presence, calm and observant, had immediately unsettled both Thorne and Eleanor, though they tried not to show it. Ava Miller and Samuel Cole were not present. Richard had insisted this first confrontation would be handled by him, armed with the devastating dossier they had helped him compile. Richard began, his voice deceptively mild, a stark contrast to the storm raging within him. "Thank you both for coming on such short notice." He gestured towards a meticulously arranged stack of documents on the polished coffee table. "I've had some time to reflect on Miss Miller's interruption, and to do some further digging of my own." Thorne scoffed. Richard surely were not still entertaining the fantasies of a janitor's daughter. "My legal team. Your legal team. They've all assured us the contract is ironclad, mutually beneficial." "Ah, yes, the legal teams," Richard said, a chilling edge to his voice. He picked up the top document. It's fascinating what one can find when one looks beyond the official sign-offs. For instance, this rather insightful report from a Mr. Samuel Cole, formerly of Pierce Industries, dated almost 5 years ago. He paused, his eyes locking onto Thorne, then flicking to Eleanor, whose smile wavered almost imperceptibly. It details a remarkably similar pattern of, shall we say, advantageous liability structuring in several smaller acquisitions proposed by Thorne Consolidated. Acquisitions, I might add, that were strongly championed at the time. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice like cool silk. "Richard Darling, dredging up old personnel grievances. Samuel Cole was let go for incompetence and a negative attitude. You know that." Do I, Eleanor Richards' voice was soft, dangerously so. Or was he let go because he was dangerously close to exposing a predator in our midst? He then turned to Marcus Thorne. Your artistry, as Mr. Cole so aptly put it, Marcus is quite something. But signatures, as he also noted, can be traced. He proceeded calmly, methodically to lay out the evidence, the buried risk assessments, the suspicious fast-tracking of Project Titan, the almost identical trap clauses found in Thorne's past dealings, often with shell corporations that dissolved shortly after the target company cratered. With each document Richard presented, Rachel Evans would offer a brief, incisive legal interpretation, her words like precision scalpel cuts dissecting the layers of deceit. Marcus Thorne blustered, denied, accused Richard of paranoia, of being manipulated. This is character assassination. Pierce. You're stressed looking for scapegoats. But Eleanor was different. As the weight of Richard's evidence mounted, particularly when he produced copies of offshore bank transfers from accounts linked to Thorne into a blind trust that Rachel Evans was now carefully, devastatingly connecting to entities Eleanor had an undisclosed interest in, her composure began to fray. The mask of supportive wife was cracking, revealing glimpses of the cold, calculating ambition beneath. Her perfectly manicured hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Richard, she began, her voice losing its silken quality, becoming thin, reedy. This is a misunderstanding. Marcus has always been a generous friend. Those transfers were investments. Personal investments into shell corporations that directly benefited from the financial ruin of companies Thorne acquired using tactics identical to what you both embedded in Project Titan. Rachel Evans interjected coolly, her gaze unwavering. The paper trail is rather explicit, Mrs. Pierce. Richard felt a profound weariness, a deep, soul-crushing ache. This was his wife, the woman he had shared his life with, built an empire alongside loved, or thought he had loved. Who was this stranger sitting before him? The final irrefutable blow came not from a document, but from a small digital audio file. Samuel Cole, it turned out, had been meticulous. Before his dismissal, sensing the walls closing in, he had made a recording of a particularly candid phone call between Marcus Thorne and an then unidentified female accomplice discussing the Pierce endgame and how Richard's sentimentality will be his undoing. He hadn't known for certain who the woman was at the time, only that her voice sounded familiar, influential within Pierce Industries. He'd kept it a bitter memento of his own downfall. Now, with Richard's world collapsing, Samuel had finally given it to him. Richard pressed play. The room filled with Marcus Thorne's confident drawl, and then Eleanor's voice. Unmistakably Eleanor's. Cool, precise, and utterly ruthless, discussing how to manage Richard, how to ensure he signed, how once the ink is dry, it's all ours. The recording detailed their long-standing partnership, a parasitic alliance forged years ago, built on a shared voracious appetite for wealth and power, with Pierce Industries as their ultimate prize. It spoke of her resentment at always being the power behind the throne, her desire to step into the light to control it all herself, with Marcus as her willing and equally enriched partner. The sound of Eleanor's voice, so intimately familiar, now twisted into this monstrous betrayal, struck Richard with the force of a physical blow. He felt the blood drain from his face. The recording ended. Silence, heavy and suffocating, descended. Marcus Thorne sat slumped. His bluster finally extinguished a look of grim resignation on his face. Eleanor Pierce, however, was a different spectacle. The mask was gone entirely. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but not with fear. It was something harder, something almost defiant. When she finally spoke, Her voice was devoid of all its former warmth, flat and cold as a gravestone. So she said, a bitter twist to her lips. The little janitor's girl was cleverer than all of us, wasn't she? And you, Richard. She looked at him, then a chilling emptiness in her eyes. You were always too trusting, too predictable. It was your greatest weakness, and my greatest opportunity. There was no remorse, no apology, only the stark, unvarnished truth of her ambition, her contempt. Richard stared at her, the woman he thought he knew, the life he thought he had. It all crumbled around him, turning to ash and dust. The pain was a gaping chasm, an abyss of betrayal so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. He had built his world on a foundation of lies, a meticulously crafted illusion orchestrated by the person he had held closest. The crushing weight of that truth in its full, unadulterated horror settled upon him, and for a long moment Richard Pierce, Titan of industry, felt nothing but the echoing void of his own shattered heart. The velvet curtain had not just been torn, it had been ripped to shreds, revealing a wasteland where he once believed a beautiful life had stood. The heavy oak door of the study clicked shut, leaving Richard Pierce in a silence more profound, more suffocating than any he had ever known. Marcus Thorne had been escorted out by Richard's head of security, sputtering empty threats and vowing retaliation, his bravado a pathetic, deflated thing. Eleanor had simply walked out after her chilling admission, her composure a brittle shield, leaving behind a chasm of wreckage where their life together had once stood. Rachel Evans had stayed long enough to ensure preliminary legal boundaries were understood by all parties, her calm professionalism a stark contrast to the emotional devastation that permeated the room. Now Richard was alone. He sank into his leather armchair, the one that had always felt like a throne of command, but now felt like a dock for the accused. The damning audio recording of Eleanor's voice still echoed in the recesses of his mind, each replayed syllable a fresh twist of the knife in his soul. His wife. The woman who had shared his bed, his dreams, his triumphs and sorrows for over 25 years. A lie. All of it a meticulously constructed lie. He stared at the portrait of his father, a stern, unyielding man who had built Pierce Industries from nothing on a bedrock of integrity and hard work. Truth is the only currency that never devalues, Richard, his father used to say. How utterly he had failed that principle. He had been so blinded by success, so cocooned in the easy comfort of his affluent world, so readily swayed by Eleanor's sophisticated charm, and Marcus Thorne's promises of ever greater expansion, that he had become deaf to the quiet whispers of caution, blind to the rot spreading beneath the gilded surface of his life. His thoughts drifted to Samuel Cole. He remembered Cole now with painful clarity, a slightly stooped, earnest man with intelligent eyes, presenting his meticulously researched reports, his voice firm with conviction, as he warned of Thorne's predatory tactics. And Richard, influenced by Eleanor's subtle dismissals of Cole as not a visionary too resistant to progress, had nodded politely and filed those warnings away, effectively silencing the one man who had tried to save him from himself. The shame of it burned like acid. And then there was Ava Miller, a 19-year-old girl helping her mother clean offices, possessing more insight, more courage than his entire board of directors and his highly paid legal team combined. He had almost dismissed her too, out of arrogance, out of impatience. The thought made him physically sick. She had stood there small and seemingly insignificant in that grand boardroom, and spoken a truth so potent it had brought his empire to the brink, only to save it from utter annihilation. The next morning, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He drove himself not in his chauffeured limousine, but in an older, unassuming sedan from his collection, to the modest apartment building where Ava and Maria Miller lived. He had called ahead, his voice hoarse, requesting a few minutes of their time. Maria opened the door, her expression a mixture of apprehension and a mother's protective suspicion. Ava stood just behind her, her gaze direct, intelligent, and unnervingly perceptive. Richard stood awkwardly in their small, immaculately clean living room. The contrast between this humble space and the opulent deceit of his own home was not lost on him. "Mrs. Miller Ava," he began, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. I don't have words adequate to express my gratitude or my profound apology." He looked directly at Ava. "You were right. About everything. You showed a courage and an integrity that I and many others who should have known better failed to demonstrate. I am deeply sorry for the initial disbelief and for any distress this has caused you and your mother." He then turned to Maria. "Mrs. Miller, please be assured your position at Pierce Industries is secure. More than secure. Any duress you've been under will cease immediately. And Ava," he looked back at the young woman, "the company and I personally owe you a debt that can never truly be repaid." Ava simply nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "I just hope that going forward, everyone at Pierce Industries will feel empowered to read the fine print, no matter their job title." Maria, ever practical, added a touch of unintended humor with a heartfelt sigh. "Yes, Mr. Pierce, and perhaps invest in a better document shredder for those sensitive papers. My Ava here, she reads everything you know, says it's more interesting than most television shows." Richard managed a faint, pained smile. "Your daughter is an extraordinary young woman, Mrs. Miller. And you are right. We have much to learn, and much to change." Later that day, his private phone rang. It was Eleanor. Her voice, stripped of its usual artifice, was a desperate, tearful plea. "Richard, please. Think of our history, our friends, the company's reputation, my reputation. Marcus. He manipulated me. He pressured me. We can contain this. A quiet settlement. People don't need to know everything. Think of what this will do to us, to the Pierce name." He listened, the words washing over him, but they found no purchase. The Eleanor he had loved or believed he loved was a phantom. The woman on the phone was a stranger, fighting for her own survival, still weaving webs of deceit. The Pierce name, he realized, had already been tarnished, not by exposure, but by the corruption that had festered within. The only way to cleanse it was with the unvarnished, painful truth. He ended the call, his resolve hardening. He walked back to his study, to the portrait of his father. The stern eyes seemed to hold a flicker of approval now, or perhaps it was just his own conscience finally aligning with the legacy of integrity he had so long neglected. There was only one path forward. He picked up the phone and dialed Rachel Evans. "Rachel," he said, his voice firm, devoid of any hesitation. "It's Richard Pierce. I've made my decision." There was a pause on the other end. "And that is Mr. Pierce, pursue it." Richard stated each word, a heavy weight, yet liberating. "Pursue it all. Every lead, every implicated individual, regardless of their position or their relationship to me. No settlements, no cover-ups. I want the truth, the whole truth, brought to light. And I want justice, whatever the cost." He could almost hear Rachel Evans nodding, a small, satisfied smile in her voice when she replied, "Understood, Mr. Pierce. We'll begin immediately." As he hung up, Richard felt a profound sense of desolation, the bitter tang of betrayal still raw. But beneath it, almost imperceptibly at first, was a sliver of something else, a grim, clean sense of purpose. The reckoning would be painful, the fallout immense. But he had made his choice. He had chosen the harder path, the one paved with bitter truths, but it was the only path that might eventually lead back to a semblance of honor. The moment Richard Pierce gave Rachel Evans the green light, the storm broke. Lawsuits were filed with a speed and precision that left Eleanor Pierce and Marcus Thorne reeling despite their expensive legal teams. The initial complaints, meticulously detailed and backed by a damning array of preliminary evidence, hit the financial world like a seismic shock. Pierce Industries, Sue's CEO's wife and key business partner in multi-billion-dollar fraud scheme, screamed the headlines. The carefully constructed facade of the Pierce dynasty began to crumble under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. Eleanor and Marcus, through their phalanx of slick, high-powered attorneys, immediately went on the offensive. They issued scathing denials, painting Richard as a man overwrought, unstable, perhaps even vengeful, after discovering personal indiscretions. They hinted at a corporate power struggle, a desperate attempt by Richard to consolidate control by discrediting his most trusted advisors. The media, smelling blood in the water, lapped it up. And for a while, public opinion swayed confused by the mudslinging. Pierce Industries' stock took a predictable, nauseating dive. But Richard Pierce, the man who had been so easily fooled for years, was no longer the same. The betrayal had stripped away his complacency, reforging him in a crucible of pain and regret. He convened an emergency press conference, not in the sterile environment of a corporate briefing room, but in the old, somewhat dilapidated community hall his father had funded decades ago in one of the city's working-class neighborhoods. It was a symbolic choice. Standing before a barrage of flashing cameras and skeptical journalists, Richard Pierce did not make excuses. He spoke with a raw, unvarnished honesty that was utterly disarming. "I stand before you today," he began, his voice steady, despite the tremor he felt deep inside, not just as the CEO of Pierce Industries, but as a man who failed. I failed to see the truth that was right in front of me. I failed to protect the company my father built. I trusted too much, and I questioned too little. He went on to detail, without revealing legally sensitive specifics, the nature of the internal conspiracy, his voice cracking only when he spoke of the profound personal betrayal that had shaken him to his core. Then his expression shifted a new resolve, hardening his features. But this is not just a story of failure. It is also a story of extraordinary courage. He spoke of Ava Miller, not by name initially to protect her privacy, but as a young woman of remarkable integrity and perception, an employee in this very building who saw what we all missed and had the bravery to speak truth to power at great personal risk. He announced the immediate suspension of all executives implicated in the preliminary findings, the launch of a company-wide independent forensic audit, and his first concrete step towards reform. Today, I am pleased to announce the return of Mr. Samuel Cole to Pierce Industries as a special advisor to the board, heading a new internal corporate governance and ethics oversight committee. Mr. Cole Richard continued, a genuine warmth in his voice as he gestured to Samuel, who stood a little uncomfortably at the side of the small stage, is a man whose warnings I once tragically ignored. I will not make that mistake again. Samuel Cole, looking slightly bewildered by the sudden limelight, but with a spark of vindicated fire in his eyes, gave a curt, dignified nod. The legal battle, meanwhile, was intensifying. Rachel Evans, with her no-nonsense demeanor and a mind like a steel trap, was a formidable presence in the preliminary hearings. Eleanor and Marcus's lawyers, renowned for their aggressive tactics and theatrical courtroom antics, found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by Rachel's meticulous preparation and quiet, cutting logic. "Your Honor, one of Thorne's lawyers boomed during a motion to dismiss this entire case rests on the overactive imagination of a teenage girl and the belated convenient remorse of a CEO trying to salvage his own reputation." Rachel Evans rose calm amidst the bluster. "Your Honor." She countered her voice, even but carrying an undeniable authority. "The evidence which we will present in due course rests not on imagination, but on audited financial trails, sworn affidavits, and expert forensic analysis. As for belated remorse, sometimes it takes an unvarnished truth, however unexpectedly delivered, to awaken a conscience. The age or position of the messenger does not alter the validity of the message." Her subtle, almost imperceptible glance towards the opposing counsel seemed to carry a hint of dry amusement at their bluster, a silent commentary that didn't go unnoticed by the judge. Ava Miller, shielded as much as possible from the media circus by Rachel and Richard, gave her deposition in a quiet, secure location. Under the relentless, often condescending questioning from Thorne's legal team, she remained a picture of composure. She recounted her discovery of the clause with simple, unshakable clarity. When one lawyer tried to trip her up on complex legal terminology, she replied calmly, "I may not have a law degree, sir, but I understand what it means when one party takes all the risk and the other takes all the benefit. It didn't seem fair. It seemed like a trap. My grandfather always said, if something looks too good to be true for one side in a deal, it usually means it's a disaster waiting to happen for the other." Her directness, her inherent honesty, was more powerful than any legal jargon. She even managed a small wry smile when she reiterated, "And as I believe I mentioned to Mr. Pierce, just because my mother and I clean the floors doesn't mean we don't see the dirt." The turning point, the moment the already teetering defense of Eleanor and Marcus truly began to crumble, came unexpectedly. A young paralegal, Emily Carter, who had worked for nearly 2 years in Marcus Thorne's private legal department before quitting due to what she termed a toxic and unethical environment, had been following the case with growing unease. Thorne's public denials, his attempts to smear Richard Pierce and the anonymous young woman, didn't sit right with what she had witnessed. Inspired by Richard Pierce's public admission of fault and the courage of the unnamed janitor's daughter, Emily Carter contacted Rachel Evans. She possessed copies of internal memos Thorne believed had been shredded memos that explicitly detailed discussions about mitigating Pierce's leverage post-merger and structuring liability clauses for maximum Thorne advantage. One memo even had Eleanor Pierce's initials in the margin, next to a particularly damning handwritten note, "Ensure Richard doesn't get bogged down in these details. Focus him on the legacy aspect." When Rachel Evans presented this new irrefutable evidence during a pre-trial disclosure, meeting the lead attorney for Eleanor Pierce visibly paled. Marcus Thorne's lawyer immediately began to bluster about stolen documents and disgruntled former employees, but the damage was done. The carefully constructed wall of denial had been breached, and the truth in all its ugly detail was flooding in. Justice Richard Pierce, realized with a grim sense of certainty, was no longer a distant hope. It was rapidly becoming an inevitability, and the price of that truth for Eleanor and Marcus was about to be levied in full. The courtroom was hushed, the air thick with anticipation as the judge delivered the verdicts. Guilty, on all counts, conspiracy to commit corporate fraud, falsifying financial documents, obstruction of justice. The words fell like hammer blows, each one sealing the fate of Eleanor Pierce and Marcus Thorne. Their carefully constructed empire of deceit had crumbled into dust. Thorne, ever the narcissist, looked genuinely shocked, as if he truly believed his own lies would carry him through. Eleanor, however, simply closed her eyes, a single silent tear tracing a path down her perfectly sculpted cheek. A tear not of remorse, Richard suspected, but of a queen dethroned. The sentences were substantial. Long years in federal prison, significant financial penalties, their names forever etched in the annals of corporate infamy. Justice slow and arduous had finally been served. For Richard there was no elation, only a profound, weary sense of closure, and the quiet, somber understanding that this was the necessary, painful price for truth. In the months that followed, Richard Pierce threw himself into the Herculean task of rebuilding Pierce Industries, not just its finances, but its very soul. He didn't just prune the rot, he ripped it out by the roots. The independent forensic audit laid bare every compromised deal, every unethical shortcut that had been allowed to fester under Eleanor and Thorne's influence. Heads rolled from senior executives who had been complicit down to mid-level managers who had chosen silence over integrity. Samuel Cole, now officially installed as the head of corporate governance and ethics, became Richard's right hand in this endeavor. His office, ironically, was the very one from which he had been so unceremoniously dismissed years ago. There was a certain grim satisfaction in that Samuel admitted to Richard with his characteristic dry wit. "The view is much better from this side of the desk, Richard," he'd remarked, "especially when you're not constantly looking over your shoulder for the next backstabber." Together they implemented new transparent protocols, an open-door policy for reporting concerns without fear of retribution, and a mandatory ethics training program for every employee from the mailroom to the newly reconstituted boardroom. One of Richard's most significant and personally meaningful acts was the establishment of the Ava Miller Beacon of Truth Fellowship. It was a substantial scholarship fund designed to support bright, underprivileged students who demonstrated exceptional courage, integrity, and a commitment to ethical principles in their chosen fields. At the modest press conference announcing the fellowship, Ava Miller stood beside Richard, not as a curiosity or a footnote to a scandal, but as a poised, intelligent young woman who had become an unlikely symbol of hope. She spoke briefly, her voice clear and steady, thanking Mr. Pierce, and expressing her hope that the fellowship would encourage others to always listen to that small voice inside that knows the difference between what is easy and what is right. Maria Miller watched from the front row, tears of pride streaming down her face, her job at Pierce Industries, now not just secure, but a source of immense, quiet dignity. 3 years later, Ava Miller, now a standout student in her final year of a pre-law program at a prestigious university, her tuition fully covered by the fellowship that bore her name, though she insisted on maintaining a part-time campus job to keep me grounded. Mr. Pierce sat across from Richard in his redesigned office. The heavy, oppressive mahogany had been replaced with lighter woods and more glass letting in the sunshine. The portrait of his father still hung in its place of honor, but now it felt less like a judgmental gaze and more like a quiet affirmation. "Professor Davies says my paper on corporate liability and whistleblower protections is one of the best he's seen in years," Ava said, a small, confident smile playing on her lips. "He particularly liked the real-world examples I subtly alluded to." Richard chuckled, a warm, genuine sound that came more easily to him these days. "I have no doubt, Ava. You always did have a knack for seeing right to the heart of things." Sometimes he added a touch of that old self-deprecating humor in his voice. "It still stings a little how thoroughly you outmaneuvered a room full of supposed experts, myself included." "It wasn't about outmaneuvering Mr. Pierce," Ava said gently. "It was just about what was true. And sometimes the truth needs a little help to be heard, especially when it's inconvenient." Their conversation flowed easily, a comfortable exchange between a mentor and a cherished protégé, a friendship forged in the crucible of crisis and rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect. Richard saw in Ava not just the young woman who had saved his company, but a future leader, someone who would undoubtedly make her mark on the world with both brilliance and integrity. Later that evening, Richard stood by the large window in his office, looking out at the glittering cityscape. The legal battles were over. Eleanor was a ghost from a past life. Her appeals exhausted her name. A fading headline. Pierce Industries' Lena, perhaps, and certainly humbled, was slowly but surely regaining its footing, its reputation now being rebuilt on something far more solid than inflated projections and deceitful contracts. Samuel Cole was a trusted colleague, a bulwark against any return to the old ways. The scars of Eleanor's betrayal would likely never fully fade, a dull ache that served as a constant reminder. But the all-consuming pain had receded, replaced by a quiet, earned peace. He had faced the ugliest truths about his life, his marriage, his own failings, and he had not broken. He had chosen to rebuild not just his company, but himself. He thought of Ava Miller, that spark of a girl, and a genuine smile touched his lips. She, and the truth she had so bravely carried, had been his unexpected salvation. He had learned the hard way that true strength wasn't about invulnerability or unquestioned authority. It was about the courage to listen, the humility to admit when you were wrong, and the unwavering commitment to do what was right, no matter how high the cost. The city lights twinkled back at him like distant, hopeful stars. Pierce Industries had a new legacy now, one not just of profit, but of principle. And Richard Pierce, the man who had almost lost it all, finally understood that some of the most profound truths, the ones that could save or shatter worlds, could indeed come from the quietest voices in the most unexpected of places. All you had to do was be willing to listen. And so a chapter closes, not just for Ava Miller and Richard Pierce, but perhaps for a way of thinking that too often dismisses the power of a single honest voice. It leaves us to wonder, doesn't it? How often does real courage, real clarity reside in the most unexpected places, waiting only for a chance to be heard, above the noise of assumption and authority? Life has a peculiar way of testing our foundations, revealing that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest, most unwavering stand for what is right. This journey of truth betrayal and hard-won redemption has certainly given us much to reflect upon, and we imagine it might have stirred something in you too. We'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts. What part of Ava's extraordinary courage, or perhaps Richard's challenging path to reclaiming his integrity, resonated most deeply with you, and why your insights truly help us shape these narratives? If there was a moment in today's story that particularly moved you, or if you have any suggestions on how we can make our storytelling even more compelling in the future, please do share your feedback in the comments below. We cherish your perspective and are always striving to bring you stories that connect and inspire. If this story of an unlikely hero and the enduring strength of truth touched your heart, we'd be so grateful if you'd give it a like. And if you feel its message might resonate with others, please consider sharing it. To continue exploring the depths of human experience with us, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. That way, you won't miss out on any of our upcoming stories as we continue to uncover the moments that define us. Thank you for joining us on this journey today. Until next time, may you always find the courage to listen to the truth, no matter how quietly it speaks.